I'm Alex Tell. I'm the gallery manager here at the Mishkin Gallery. For anyone who doesn't know, the Mishkin Gallery is part of Baruch College at City University of New York. All of our exhibitions and programs are always free and open to the public. Today's talk is in conjunction with our current exhibition, Warhol, People and Things, at the Casa São Roque in Porto, Portugal, which was curated by Elena Claire Feldman and Barbara Pivovarska. The exhibition features works by Andy Warhol from the Mishkin Gallery collection, alongside contemporary artists, two of whom are on our panel today, John Miller and Anna Ostoya. The panel is moderated by Christopher Schmidt. I will give you a quick background on each of our presenters, and then they'll talk for a few minutes, and then we'll follow that with a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to audience questions, which you can just share in the chat. So our presenters today, John Miller is an artist and writer based in New York and Berlin. Miller has had retrospective exhibitions at La Magazine in Grenoble, the Kunstverein in Hamburg, the Kunsthalle Zurich, the ICA Miami, the Museum Bell Park in Kreins, Switzerland, and the Schinkel Pavilion in Berlin. His publications include Mike Kelly, Educational Complex, The Ruin of Exchange, Selective Writings, and The Price Club, Selective Writings, 1977 to 1998, as well as Reconstructing a Public Sphere. Miller is a professor of professional practice at Barnard College's Art History Department. Anna Ostoya is an artist whose work spans multiple aesthetic traditions and includes painting, collage, photography, and writing. It has been shown internationally at Zaketa National Gallery, Warsaw, La Kunsthalle Mulhouse, the 2015 Lyon Biennial, Manifesta 7, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Tate St. Ives, and Kunsthalle Basel-Land. She has collaborated on books with Ben Lerner and Chantal Mouffe. Christopher Schmidt is a professor of English and Liberal Studies at the City University of New York, LaGuardia, and the Graduate Center. He is the author of a critical study, The Poetics of Waste, and has written on themes of waste in Vic Muñoz, Ilio Otisaka, and Warhol's Time Capsules. So I am going to now hand it off to Christopher Schmidt, who will present on some of his work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. Yes, okay. I just wanted to thank you for inviting me, and I wanted to thank Elena and Barbara for curating this exhibition, and for Anna and John for joining us. And I think so. Alex, I think asked me to share my work and moderate because I wrote several years ago sort of a lengthy article about what I called Warhol's problem project, the time capsules. And some of you might be familiar with this project. And what's interesting about it, I think, and I think why Alex asked me to speak about it, and because it kind of relates to some of the work of Warhol's that is on display in the show in Casa São Roque. And in the sense both that some of the work, the photography work, is maybe in some ways maybe ancillary to some of like the work we recognize as maybe Warhol's sort of great silkscreen portraits or sculptures, and then there's also some ephemera of Warhol's that's on display in a vitrine in the exhibition space. And so I think that these how we treat the work and how Warhol's processes and practices have sort of been very influential and telling, both in sort of the moment he was in, and then in artists kind of responding to him and his legacy, I think has been very productive and can be located in some of the things I was thinking about in discussing the time capsules. So this picture that you're seeing is a picture of the time capsules in what is probably their current status. This picture is probably 10 years old or older. And this is in the kind of the administrative bowels of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Um, and so they're not in any way in public exhibition, except that sometimes, occasionally, they are opened and displayed, as this very kind of photogenic time capsule. Is time capsule 25 is displayed here, and there are about 610 of them. And what they are, they emerged, kind of by chance when Warhol was moving from one factory space on Union Square West to another factory space on a little bit higher up on Broadway in New York City. And this idea of like packing up all those materials from his office gave him, I think, the idea to kind of sort of launch this project. Like he was very interested in collecting and storage, and suddenly he thought, "Oh, this is very interesting to have these boxes of like of my office ephemera and memorabilia." And we've been talking a little bit in sort of leading up to this exhibit about this kind of transition that Warhol made in some ways, casually, in discussing the fact, sort of a transition from a factory space, or sort of marketing his workspace as the factory, to then kind of more casually calling it the office at a certain point in around this period in the 1970s. And so these boxes, they kind of they're a product of that move, and they kind of express, I think, also that transition. And so they are kind of like hovering between this kind of like a product, maybe an art product that a factory might produce, and maybe the administrative sort of unconscious, or the administrative background material or source material that emerges in an office. So, when I was thinking about the time capsules and how they kind of hover between these various kind of categories, and Warhol himself couldn't really decide what to do with them. He was sort of torn between considering them an art project, in this kind of way of like a periodic performance. So he would sort of collect the ephemera from his office space, usually about once a month, maybe 1 to 3 times a month, and collect them in these boxes. But then in his writings, in both like the philosophy of Andy Warhol and in the Andy Warhol Diaries, which was published posthumously, he sort of reflects on them and thinks of them like, should I market them as sculpture? Should I sell the boxes off as a surprise to different collectors? And if so, should I include something that's more of a traditional sort of hand, an art object showing the hand? Then there's this question of like, well, maybe they were actually, they were also in some ways an archive, right? That they kind of record the pop unconscious, all of this media stream that was kind of going through Warhol's mind and hands, and some of which he picked out, as he did, when reading the newspaper and finding like, a picture of a tuna can that had botulism in it, or a publicity still of Marilyn Monroe that became the basis for one of his portraits. Um, or were they, or were they actually just a symptom of what some have seen as a pathology in terms of hoarding and collecting, right? So that they also are a marker of his own kind of collecting habits. And in his philosophy of Andy Warhol and in his diaries, he talks a lot. He has a lot of anxiety about what I call, and he himself calls waste, right? He was sort of worried about wasting space, and so he had this fantasy of sort of sending all his materials in his closet to a space in New Jersey. So he's kind of thinking about like, oh, if I could only send all this excess material that I have to another place. And so the time capsules are in some ways an expression of this practice. I'm just going to quickly run through some of the, some art precedents or some related art pieces, right? So there's Duchamp's sort of museum in a box. He had this own moon museum in which he contributed a drawing that became part of a drawing that was actually deposited on the moon. And some people have speculated that this was the drawing he imagined putting in each of these time capsules. There's Piero Manzoni's Artist Shit, which is a really intriguing project which kind of expresses the boundaries around, this art object. So he imagined sealing these boxes and selling them. And I think there's something was very similar happening in this, where to violate the container would be in some ways to sort of corrupt the project. And then on Kawara's Today series, where he kind of made a painting each day, and 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 also then collected sort of a piece of, the New York Times or a newspaper or wherever in whatever city he was, to kind of monumentalize that day. So I think we can see connections to a lot of other art projects like this. Um, but then I think it's also useful to keep in mind these other contexts where Warhol himself went into an archive and created an exhibition in RISD Museum in 1969. And this is sort of a funny image where he decided to show the museum's entire shoe collection. So he was very interested and thinking a lot about going into archives and in some ways emulating that and kind of wanting to create an archive of his own. And then I'm going to skip over that and come back to that later, maybe. And then, there were also his personal collections, where in his townhouse on the Upper East Side, certain rooms became uninhabitable because he was collecting cookie jars and, certain types of maybe sort of popular furniture or sort of some periods of furniture. And so he was always kind of skirting collecting too much and maybe being labeled a hoarder. So these kind of three fields, I think, are related to the time capsules, but are also in a way related to some of the processes and practices that the contemporary artists in this exhibition are also working under and engaging. And so two of those artists are Anna Ostoya and John Miller. And so I'm going to turn it over to Anna now to talk about her work. And then after that, I believe John is going to talk about his work. So we'll have more discussion about some of these themes and in the Q&A, and the discussion and Q&A following. Okay, Anna? Anna, you might need to unmute yourself.
Here, you can hear me, right? Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thanks to everyone who is listening us now. I'll talk about my pieces in the show, which are from the series Memorabilia. I'm actually sitting in front of a part of this project. It's an ongoing series, and by now I've made about 80 pieces. Here, I would like to show one of them up close so you can get an idea of its size. It's basically a photograph mounted on a board with painted sides, and the image dictates the colors of the sides. The images are found on the internet, and they undergo quite a lot of digital rendering and proof printing. And although I work on them mostly digitally, I like for these photographs to have a sort of three-dimensional form, as they are tactile. And I guess the title Memorabilia also underlines this idea. And I prepared some images for you. Let me try to share the screen. I hope it works. Okay. Share. Play. Okay. So here you see how the images are installed in Portugal. The curators chose 11 pieces, which they felt fit the subject of the show the best. Here again, you can see the sides, and here is a list of works with captions that's available for visitors. The captions have brief descriptions of the images, so if someone wants to learn more about them, they can easily Google them. Here is one of the very early pieces. You can see its side and the front. And I'd say the juxtaposition is the strategy in all the pieces in the series. I put together images which are alike visually, but which have different context or content. The differences in some pieces manifest oppositional worldviews, but in others, they just mark a sort of contrast of, for example, cultural backgrounds. In this case, there is an image of an exam chair at Planned Parenthood, which has been used in a few articles about abortion and women's rights, paired with Little Chair by Andy Warhol, a silkscreen of an electric chair used for executions. In general, the ideas for all the pieces in the series came to me from the internet, predominantly from reading the news. So while reading the news, I saw the image of the exam chair, which then recalled the memory of an electric chair. But it also could be that the article itself and the arguments it presented made me think about the death penalty, thus the electric chair and the larger question of our relationship to life and death questions. In any case, I chose to use Warhol's chair rather than a real chair because to many, Warhol represents ambiguity, and any answer to the grand questions of life and death subject is going to be ambiguous to this or that group of people. It's not the first time in memorabilia that I used this strategy. I used the juxtapositions and like these clashes of contexts and ideas already in my series Autopies, Notes, Copies, and Masterpieces, started in 2009. Here you can see an example of the work from that series, which was concerned with history, predominantly art history. The pieces were more sculptural, each had a different form. And despite differences, I think the questions in both series are the same, and they are about the different and competing narratives and about the relationships of power. Here is how I started memorabilia. I started it last year, and to a certain extent, I think it was the outcome of the pandemic, the time when I got unusually absorbed in reading the news. Here are a few more examples. Which came from reading about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the biometric devices taken over by Afghans when the US troops left. The image of a man whose eye is being scanned is paired with a screenshot from Un Chien Andalou, the scene I can't watch. And here, a less dramatic juxtaposition. It's a portrait of David Bowie paired with a girl from a painting from the 1960s by the Russian painter Alexei Belik. Again, images from different cultures and situations. Yeah, but maybe there is a potential for a story here. And here is a piece somewhat more politically provocative. It's a composition of airstrikes by the US-led coalition in Mosul in 2017 and of a recent Russian strike in Kiev. According to Amnesty International, evidence gathered on the ground in Mosul pointed to an, quote, alarming pattern of US-led coalition airstrikes, which have destroyed whole houses with entire families inside. Here is an example of movie fiction merging with reality. On the left, there is Sylvester Stallone playing Rambo. On the right, there is the Iraqi commander Abu Israel, nicknamed Rambo because of his incredible strength and the large number of ISIS fighters he killed. There are videos of him firing 2 big machine guns, one in each hand. And a few more images. Here we have Dolly Parton, the American country music star, and Alla Pugacheva, the Russian pop singer, and both are famous for their hair. And here is an example of a pairing from the same news event, a labor strike. During the strike, the company advertised jobs for temporary workers at higher wages, while refusing to raise the pay of the striking workers. Here, a pairing of historical images, the UNIS towers in Sarajevo burning during the Balkan War, and the Twin Towers in New York after the terrorist attack. An iconic image of a movie audience wearing 3D glasses in 1950s, which is paired with a recent image of crowds attending an event with phones. Another historical pairing, And here the last image, which brings us back to Andy Warhol. Here is the man surrounded by the factory members in 1969, paired with the members of the Rainbow Coalition in a picture from the same year. The Rainbow Coalition was the anti-racist, anti-class, multicultural movement founded in Chicago. It was a joint action uniting working-class Blacks, whites, and Latinos against poverty. And a question I like to think comes up when seeing the piece and knowing the background of the images is, which scene would you prefer to be associated with? And just to sum up, there is an ambition in memorabilia to be thought-provoking, and it reflects what I think about art, that it should move us visually, emotionally, and also inspire critical thinking. The series is also an attempt to preserve the images, the events which shape us and our time and which could be very soon forgotten. They are a reflection of what the media delivers to us in this particular part of the world, and also what is being delivered by search engines to my device. And I can just say that with time, this series has become a sort of more of a diary or a calendar of current events. There is more of a sense of chronological order in the more recent work. And maybe the pieces could be called time capsules. And it's an open question whether they will succeed or fail to register the same kind of meanings in the future. I liked that. Let me just finish and stop the share. Stop share. I liked that question which you asked in your, or these comments which you made about Warhol's time capsules craze, saying that certain things succeeded in, like you saw some meaning in some pieces you discovered in these boxes, and somewhere, most, I guess, failed, right?
Great, thank you, Anna. That's so so wonderful and provocative, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those issues more shortly. So great, John. Do you want to take over and talk about your work?
Are we getting feedback still, or is my audio okay?
Sounds good so far.
I too am glad to take part in this discussion and in the show, and I thank everyone involved in organizing it. The work of mine that's included in the exhibition is taken from an ongoing series I started in 1994 called The Middle of the Day. And in Porto, it appears as 3 slideshows, and it's work drawn from about the last 4 years, and altogether there's something like 130 or 140 images, and the photos are all pictures that I take between the hours of 12 and 2, and so there's a kind of temporal index attached to them. And one reason I chose this time was because it's my least favorite time of day. And one reason why so I kind of just felt my way into it associatively, but then I started thinking, well, in some ways this time of day represents a conflict for me, and perhaps many other people too, where a desire to rest meets a demand to produce. So there's a kind of, the forces of work and leisure are kind of running up against each other. But rather than to document that explicitly, I just wanted to kind of take readings of the world wherever I happen to be as it carried over through this time period. And, I suppose that could be one relationship to Warhol's time capsules, and that these inadvertently provide a kind of oblique self-portrait. And they, and maybe in ways that just because of technology end up being more explicit than the time capsules, because now photographs can be geocoded and time-stamped and all of that. So since the last 15 or more years, most of my photos have been digital. So they would carry that information as metadata. Whereas previously, I began the series shooting with a middle format camera. And I kind of went into it with sort of the typical biases of conceptual art, assuming that the camera is just a neutral instrument. And it's not that I'm into sort of classical photographic values, but rather that the further I got into the series and the more I worked with different cameras, I found that the choice of camera to some extent determines what one's subject matter is. That, so working with, say, a middle format camera, I had to manually focus and meter before shooting the image. A much smaller ratio of my shots turned out well. Photographers used to talk about a shooting ratio. Mine was fairly low, which was indicated a bad photographer. But given all that, I feel as though I take photographs that anyone else could take. And at first, I was approaching this idea from a kind of pictures theory notion that on the one hand, I was producing a photograph, but I was also shooting the photograph in such a way that it looked like a conventional picture. So I was, in a way, trying to second guess my audience, whoever they may be. But as time went on, photography really proliferated more and more intensively. One example I like to give is in the beginning of the series, if I was working on the street, I would be conspicuous because of my camera. Now in an urban environment, it's often difficult to get a picture without somebody else photographing in the background. That's one way that the camera inhabits and transforms our social landscape. When I was in school, I studied with John Baldessari in graduate school, and he's known for his photographic work. One day he asked me, do you think you'll ever, and I was doing video at the time, actually also inspired by his work. But one day he asked me, oh, do you think you'll ever do any photography? And I just said, without hesitating, no. But then in 1992, I was invited to take part in an exhibition in Berlin called Getting to Know You, that was a response to the AIDS epidemic. And I think that the curators invited me on the basis of this brown impasto sculpture I was doing at the time that had a kind of deliberate kind of experimental connotation that I meant to be provocative. But I didn't think that had to do with the epidemic per se. So I wanted to do something more specific. So what I did was to photograph the facades of buildings that had sex clubs that either closed or were closed after the onset of the epidemic. So the project was a kind of mapping, but it was also paradoxical in that I was shooting something that was no longer there. So photographing an absence, if you will. And in some ways, I could argue that the subject of my midday photos is time, but time only registers very obliquely. Like you might look at the collection and realize there's no night shots or something like that, and start to triangulate in on when they were shot. But apart from the series title, there's nothing that really stipulates midday. And even my definition of midday is this 2-hour period has an element of arbitrariness to it. Yeah, and then otherwise, I think that the majority of photos I've taken could fall under the rubric of street photography, something I sometimes feel guilty about because I guess I have this bias of going out into the world and taking pictures, but I think that, you know, sometimes I try to think about what I'm doing in terms of classic genres of iconography, so portraiture, landscape, and still life. And I think of the street photography as mostly being landscape, but in a fairly recent show I had in Kriens, Switzerland, I was feeling guilty about all this street photography. So I wanted to balance out the genres. So I deliberately shot portraits. Some were candid portraits, some I asked friends to pose for me. I shot still lifes. And then I found sometimes one photograph would satisfy 2 or 3 of the categories as well, so that they weren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And then I suppose another kind of undercurrent through this, and what was really sort of afoot for me when I began the series, was this notion of getting some sense of everyday life through the camera. And it's one reason why I was going for non-spectacular images in a way, and also images that didn't look as though there was something special going on photographically or distinctive. And you know, part of that, I think, goes to the informational capacity of the camera, and how, you know, and the optical unconscious, where the camera produces more information than the photographer intends. And I haven't had an opportunity to see the show in Porto, but I think that the emphasis in the show, and perhaps why I'm included in it, is to look at the less iconic aspects of Warhol's production. And really, I didn't know much about Warhol's time capsule project until I read Christopher's text. But other aspects, and also I hadn't thought of Warhol as being an influence on my work until it was put into this context. And I think that Warhol's screen tests are important to me, where they're getting at some aspect of maybe of what Agamben would call bare life or something like that, that the individual under scrutiny of the photographic apparatus. And then also the only Warhol film that I've seen from start to finish was Chelsea Girls. And there, the durational aspect connected for me in some way to everydayness. And also this idea that runs from Freud into surrealism, into situationism, or the situationist aesthetics, that the everyday, on the one hand, it's a kind of double-edged term where if we call something every day, it means that it's something that we already know, that it's banal and non-signifying, but also the idea that through that familiarity, we become habituated to a certain version of reality and fail to see its full richness. And I think that there's like some connection between that and the optical unconscious.
That's great. Thank you, John. Maybe we should stop there and kind of open to a little bit of general discussion and then Q&A. I think that's something that was interesting, John, in you know, you kind of talking about your relationship to Warhol and kind of thinking of him not being an influence. And so it was interesting to we chatted a little bit, you know, earlier, and to hear you talked about Chelsea Girls, and then you also talked about Interview magazine. And so it's you know, again, it's interesting to think about these kind of, like, as you say, like the non-iconic sort of works influencing you maybe more, maybe because you were more affiliated with sort of maybe a conceptual art in the West Coast because of your art school training. So I would love to hear you talk more about that. But Anna, maybe first we could ask you, or I could ask you about your relationship to Warhol as well, because you sort of you use his work and you use an image of him, and then maybe, you know, that maybe there's some formal you know, kind of echoes in your work of his as well. And I think what's interesting, and this also occurred to me as John was talking, is that there's a kind of, both of your projects, that you're kind of admitting a kind of passivity to, you know, whether it's kind of media, or as John was kind of saying, kind of maybe like an optical unconscious, or just kind of the excess of information in the world, and that's maybe your projects are not so much about stamping your vision or your biography on your work as much as you're admitting the world into a container that you've created. But then at the same time, there are aspects of your own positions that enter into them. And so, Anna, you know, I kind of know a little bit from reading your biography that you were born in Poland, and a lot of the work in this memorabilia series, you're juxtaposing a U.S. maybe not always, but sometimes a U.S. image with a maybe Soviet counterpart, like a picture of Reagan on a horse and Putin on a horse, or Dolly Parton and maybe a Soviet or Russian pop star or singer of some sort. And so I just was curious if maybe you had wanted to talk a little bit about your relationship to Warhol.
Yeah, thank you. To be very honest, I've tried to avoid Warhol throughout my life. I think from what I've read about him, I always felt that he was just not my type of person. Like, me and him come from very different backgrounds, you know, like, and different mindsets. He is into surface, I am into depth. He is into boredom, I am into more passion or complicated things. He is into repetition, I'm into nuances. And when, I mean, like, to really maybe explain it better, and to go back to where I come from Poland. So when I was a child in Poland, Poland is, in Poland, everything, it's a stereotype, but everything is gray, right? The nature is gray. These are beautiful grays. Also, the grays of the concrete and pavements are beautiful. But one thing that wasn't beautiful, the grays of toys and objects weren't beautiful. These were just ugly grays, what we would call in painting muddy grays. And so in the time, as a child, I had that image of the West, and especially of America, as this place of beautiful, vivid colors. And I even possessed an object like a little pink eraser, which really was fluorescent pink. I would never use it. But that was this expectation that I had towards the West. And, particularly about Disneyland. And I've never been to Disneyland in Florida, but I went to Disneyland next to Paris. I wasn't a child anymore there. And it was a ground disappointment to me. The colors were intense, but they weren't vibrantly beautiful. I felt that they were somewhat ugly, and all the attractions and the characters looked kind of creepy to me. And yeah, I have to admit, when I went to see Warhol's Marilyn Monroe at MoMA, I had the same type of experience. Like, I had so much expectations for the thing to have something in it, some form of beauty, which I actually saw in reproductions. When the work is reproduced, it like affected me more when I saw it in reproductions or printed on bags. But when I stood there in front of it, it was muddy, and there was something creepy about it also. And I couldn't find my connection to Warhol and to his work. But I like your essay, I must say. That's something what allowed me, like all the question about trash, and about how materials can be recycling, and this question of attention between if a piece of art is it a piece of art? Is it archival piece, or is it just junk? But this is sort of a question that I think is relevant to any object which is called work of art. It's a very interesting question. And there were a few other things that I could relate to, like, for example, when you talk about the tension in Warhol between like his relationship to objects being brought up in poverty with scarcity of things, and then having the abundance of them. And that's something that I guess I relate to very much, because that's what I do a lot of in my work, and I recycle a lot of materials. And I guess the way how I use Warhol in my work, it's not so much about Warhol, but as this figure that it's out there as part of American history, and this very hyped figure, right? Very important figure, but not maybe as not like father figure, or not some inspirational figure, particularly in terms of art to me.
That's so interesting. And I mean, I have to admit that I share in some ways. I mean, I'm also amazed by much of Warhol's paintings, but there is a way in which they can be disappointing when you see them in person, or that the idea of Warhol is maybe more compelling and persuasive than the objects themselves. But then there's also, I'm always surprised by seeing, like, kind of maybe the paintings of Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola bottles in there is a beauty to the objects too, but it's not always where you expect to find it. And I would also say that, so my background is in literature, and I actually came to Warhol in some ways through the philosophy of Andy Warhol, which is itself a fascinating text of performance and kind of false authority, in the sense of that he spoke most of the text into a tape recorder, transcripts of which were then edited by Bob Colacello and Pat Hackett. But there's also there's a whole chapter that isn't even Warhol speaking. It's Bridget Berlin speaking. And so these questions about like authority and voice and context are all really kind of, they're always kind of sparked by his fame and his kind of iconicity. Something you said, Anna, I thought was really interesting, which was that for you, in your first talk, you were kind of talking, and you said that Warhol represents ambiguity to you, and that to me made me think about like the question of, is Warhol critical? Is that ambiguity about the question of whether Warhol's reproduction of images or his choice of images, is he being critical of American culture, American consumption, or is he being sort of simply reproducing his own sort of uncritical consumption of it? And I think it's both at the same time, or it can be both at the same time. But to John, not to sort of speak only about Warhol, but again, I was just wondering if maybe you had a thought about that, question about Warhol's maybe criticality or how he framed works or what the meaning of his framing is. And also, you know, if I'm wondering if the processes, you know, that Warhol underwent in making his work, and maybe I thought you spoke really eloquently about the tension between like wanting to work and wanting to take leisure, like take a siesta in these kind of, I'll call them lunch poem hours, lunch photograph hours, and so, you know, I'm curious if that is kind of something that seems something about Warhol that is characteristic, right? That he like would go to parties and society events every night and kind of say, "Oh, this is so much work," he would say to his friends, whereas maybe the painting in some ways felt more fun to him. And so, I guess I would just throw that, you know, back those cluster of questions back to you and see if there's anything in them that you would like to comment on more in response to this or to Anna's comments.
Factory, it was really a collectivized production where the ideas weren't just coming from him, but from this whole subcultural group that wanted to cluster around him. But you know what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is backtrack a little bit and just think like I think it might be we shouldn't think of Warhol as being totally American, you know, which might sound weird, but I remember reading his biography, you know, that he grew up in a household that spoke a not very widespread Czech dialect. And I think for that reason, he, you know, at least according to this biography, was slow to speak. He learned English later, and also that author, who I don't remember, also argued that it sort of influenced his tendency to keep mum or say very little. And so in some ways, his look onto American culture was, I think, Eastern European inflected. And I think about Tommy Ramone in a similar way, where he conceived of the Ramones as this kind of cartoon of Americanness. He was born in Hungary in a detention camp after the war, and you know, came to the U.S. and then, you know, projected his fantasies onto the screen of a band, and then that became, you know, part of American culture. You know, so it's a kind of there's a kind of circularity to it, I suppose. There's something like a view from an outside becoming what the culture is. And yeah, I think that distance was a big part of Warhol's oeuvre. And yeah, in terms of criticality, you know, we have to think of Warhol probably as the artist who made the most decisive break with abstract expressionism, which if you didn't grow up in that era, there's no way of knowing how hegemonic it was, but it was, you know, that was when I was in school in the 70s, it was still, you know, the dominant form of teaching. And yeah, so I think that you know, in terms of like a succession of art movements, that's one way in which Warhol's work was critical. And I think he did it by bringing the camera into painting. And also that may be why seeing some of his painting can be unremarkable. And that, you know, one could think of Walter Benjamin's work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction essay, and the argument that the mechanical reproduction dispenses with the aura. You know, I think it's more complicated than that, because then over time, photographs can become erratic in some ways, like the cult around Warhol's most iconic works, can render them erratic through a kind of cult investment. But we have to say that his paintings function differently than conventional paintings, where every mark is produced intentionally. And with a photo silkscreen, the level of information may be reduced from a conventional photograph, but there's still an element, there's still a residual kind of optical unconscious there. I think one of the aspects of Warhol that intrigues me most is this playing with what you could call a signal to noise ratio. And conventionally, you want to get rid of the noise and just have purely significant information. And sadly, that's the way Interview magazine ultimately went. But I found the early issues to be really exciting because there was the presence of all this stuff that one would ordinarily think shouldn't belong there. And I suppose that another way that Warhol resonates with things that I do, going back to my time in graduate school, I played in a noise band with Mike Kelly and Tony Osler. And noise music is very much about signal to noise. And at the time we played in school, most people hated that kind of music. And I remember playing out and having in a 2-room loft where everybody crammed into the other room except for one person. Now it's much different, where there's like a cult around noise music. It's become a kind of accepted genre. Later when I played noise music with Tony Conrad and Jutta Kotter, sometimes we would do what I felt was not one of our best performances, and people liked it because there was like a predisposition, that I think has to do with like a cultic value to embrace something like that, just on principle, I suppose. But anyway, this reordering of what we might think of as significant, I think that there's a critical dimension to that, to be sure.
Alex, I wondered if we should call you back in, and if you wanted to maybe announce, ask if there's any. I mean, I can do that as well. Are there any questions? But I know also that you kind of were very interested in this theme of spatial practices and how they maybe united some of Warhol's works with some of the artists in the exhibition, and if you had a thought about a way to maybe thread some of those themes together.
Yeah, thank you everyone for these amazing presentations. It's been so fascinating. And to that point, I was thinking a lot about sort of the way that the space of production happens in Warhol. We really think about the factory, and then Chris, you mentioned this sort of move that he has to the office and this sort of bureaucratic moment, and how the sort of production, the idea of production kind of changes with the sort of change in location. And so I was thinking a lot about the sort of proliferation of images and sort of how that relates to, I guess these spaces of production. And John, you talking about sort of bringing the camera out into the public sphere, and how that has sort of like everyone has sort of turned their camera on, and that has created this sort of new way of interacting with the space around us that we sort of all engage in now. And sort of, it seems that Warhol was sort of maybe picking up on this, that early. And so, yeah, I think it's just interesting to think about, like, Anna, also in your work, the way that these sort of iconic images of like the Twin Towers on 9/11 and these sort of like spatialized landmarks that have become these iconic images are sort of, when placed in these juxtapositions, they sort of lose their sort of edge of iconicity in this way, because you see the doubling, they become less unique. And so I think that there is this sort of interesting connection between the way that both the proliferation of images and this sort of idea of information that we've been talking about, and maybe the creation of noise sort of changes the way that we are interacting with the spaces around us. And that's sort of my initial thought. I would love to hear if anyone else has any thoughts along that.
I would just add to that. I mean, I loved what both Anna and John were saying about, well, Anna, your kind of discussion of like receiving the news on your phone and kind of foregrounding that in the one diptych between the kind of society, the spectacle, like 3D glasses on the one hand, and then the phone, you know, the cell phone sort of in public space. And then John, you know, talking about the way that the camera used to make you conspicuous, and now it's like everyone is carrying around that camera. And I do think that like Warhol did use these machines. So like he carried around a tape recorder for a certain period of like the late 60s and 70s, and of course the camera. And he used to call his tape recorder my wife. I won't get anywhere without my wife. And there was a way in which these machines were kind of, you know, sort of crutches, companions, and kind of mediating between him and the world, but almost as a shield in a way. And so I think that's interesting that it's maybe everyone is kind of thinking about the machines and the mechanics of production, and Warhol was someone who was really foregrounding that, maybe because of psychological traumas in his own childhood, et cetera, et cetera. But that's, you know, a whole different story. But yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that as well.
Well, there's one thing Warhol said about tape recorders, where he said, "My mind is like a tape recorder with one button, erase."
So we have some really interesting comments in the chat. So Elena brings up this question of time, which is so essential to these works, in the time capsules, of course, and then in John, your work about the time of day, the middle of the day, and in Anna's work, how things change, the sort of the meanings of these images change in our relationship to time. The Planned Parenthood chair means something really different now than it did maybe even a few months ago. And then, yeah, if anyone wants to respond to that, we also have a very interesting and long reflection from Simon Leung, who talks about this idea of disinterestedness, that you both sort of have an ambivalent relationship to this idea. And Anna, you're choosing images that are very politically charged, but they're sort of building these like equivalence between those two. And John, how you bring up this idea of guilt multiple times as a way to discuss legitimacy of the aesthetic practice vis-a-vis street photography. And so, yeah, I think Simon is getting at this sort of different notions of how disinterestedness comes up in your work versus Warhol's work. It's sort of, I think, the idea of this indiscriminate collection of items.
Yeah, well, in terms of guilt, it's funny because it's like, even though I don't believe that someone can be totally objective, I think that it comes up for me because I feel that if I look at what I'm doing in terms of these classical genres of iconography, it's too heavy on one and neglecting the others. So yeah, it has to do with some paradigm of imagined paradigm of neutrality, I suppose.
Yeah, I can just say that thank you, John, for telling us about your relationship, or reminding me of your relationship to Warhol, and giving something what I would call a local context to him and his work. And I must say, I relate to him also. I see a lot in him, a sort of a migrant. Like I can feel certain insecurity, or read certain insecurity of a migrant, especially from that part of the war, Eastern European migrants, somewhere there in the work, or how he talks, and maybe using the ambiguity as a protection, right? And there was this question of using the iconic images. Yeah, I mean, I hope that by staging these juxtapositions, we can look at these images anew. And I think it's always important to try to look at the work, at any image, with new eyes. And because with time, the meaning changes. So we need to be always aware of time and of the context. And I hope that by staging these juxtapositions, I can somehow invite the viewers to become more active viewers, or like change their perception of what they think about these things, or at least just to ask the question, what is my automatic response to the image I see?
Yeah, I think that really relates to the next question we have from Linda Norden, which I'm looking at the time. This might be our last question. But Linda brings up the sort of idea of judgment, and Anna, in your work, this sort of way that you're asking us to consider what is archival and what is junk, and Christopher, you brought that up a lot in terms of the time capsules. What, how do we determine what is important and what is just thrown in a box? And John, you have this sort of maybe opposite impulse towards the optical unconscious, where it's sort of this preference for the banal. And so, yeah, this sort of question of how judgment plays into work, and what we can, it's, I think, back to the sort of signal and noise question as well, of where do we determine the important information, and what do we get out of looking at the noise as well, as opposed to just searching for the signal.
Yeah, well, I think in Warhol's case, there's a component of style where he made it exciting to look at these things. He made it feel more contemporary, and I think Christopher mentioned at one point where Warhol called something corny, and this was probably like a less corny way of doing things. Yeah, so I think that there was something, this turn to less obviously intentional material really resonated with a feeling of contemporary culture, or contemporaneity, something like that. I don't know. I was thinking a bit about Anna's project in terms of Abby Vorberg, who is also known to have an extensive archive. I got to see some of it one time in an exhibition in Berlin, and there it was like overwhelming. But one of the principles in his archive was to look at similar images, from disparate times and places. And I don't know that much about Warburg actually, but this he would bring together groups of images and had an extensive library of picture clippings and reproductions and things like that that he arranged and rearranged and grouped according to what he thought was significant.
Yeah, that sounds for me a great method of trying to learn about or trying to understand or connect to history, or an alternative way to try to understand it and understand the past and what impact it can have of how we see things now. And that's the method which, that's a bit the method I used, which I called actually a pseudomorphistic method, when we take images that look alike but are different, come from different places. And I would just like to say that there is a danger in such approach that that it may be puts together like that the specificity of rather than investigating the specificity of what's on the right, what's on the left, what we are presented, it might be the opposite. Someone can say it might lead to some kind of artificiality, artificial judgment about what we see. But I think a bit to answer also Linda, I think just because answers are not clear, or not clear or difficult, it's important to keep on questioning and doing these little experiments of trying to look for things in different ways. And to me, a very important text was by Katarzyna Kombro and Władysław Strzemiński about sculpture, which they wrote in 1929, and in which they wrote that the sculpture is not only defined by the space inside it, but by the space around it. And for that time, it was very revolutionary to say it. And I actually made a little textual collage out of this text and replaced the word space for information and the word sculpture for artwork. And I can just read you the few sentences which I followed the style, like their text, just exchanging these two words. And that's what it says now. Every artwork contains within its boundaries a certain amount of information. This is why we can say that the work carries information within itself. At the same time, the information contained within a work relates to the information existing outside it. The boundary between the information presented with a work and beyond it is fluid. And I think it's so important to remember it and to try to enhance this fluidity of how much information we as viewers have when approaching something, and what can we actually read and see inside the work.
Yeah, and I think one aspect about what you're doing is that the captions are as important, or the titles are as important as the images, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I want to give this possibility for viewers to look at the works from only only visually appreciate them or get interested in them. But I think it's very important to have also deliver this information that can then make them think more about what they see stands for and what's their relationship, what the work points towards to.
great. That's super interesting. Alex, should we wrap things up?
Yeah, I think so, unless anyone has one last thoughts. But I think that was amazing and super informative, and very interesting. And so I thank you all so much for participating today, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. Yeah, do you have any last words, Christopher?
I just want to thank the people who've, everyone who's attended, but also like the really provocative questions and comments in the Q&A. I think has really helped sharpen our sense of the ways that Anna and John are and are not working under, you know, the umbrella of Warhol, and you know, sort of share some practices, and then also have very distinct ways of sort of responding to information and images. And so I've learned so much today from John and Anna and Alex, and from everyone who has attended and commented. So thank you. And thank you to Elena and Barbara for curating this exciting exhibition.
Absolutely. And if anyone is in Porto, be sure to go check it out at the Casa São Roque. Okay, thank you all. Have a great day, everybody.